Have you ever imagined that a small, simple action like pumping gas could change your life? A moment where everything that seems so ordinary becomes the starting point for an unpredictable shift. But that's exactly what happened to Elizabeth Parker, an ordinary woman with nothing remarkable about her except her everyday work, until everything was pushed too far. And you know what makes this story even more significant is a kick. A simple yet powerful act that set everything in motion. A kick that didn't just cause physical harm, but also marked the beginning of a storm that would expose the truth, power, and justice. But this story isn't just about one woman and one cop. It's about a system, a society, a relentless struggle. Before we continue, I want you to pause for a moment and think about where you are. This story isn't just about a stranger. It could be your story. The story of those around you, of a society changing every day. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Together, let's embark on a journey with no way of knowing where it will end. Elizabeth Parker's story will make you rethink everything you believed, a journey where the truth will be exposed, where those who stand up against injustice will never have to endure silence. Get ready, because the conclusion of this story will take you by surprise. That day, like any other, Lizzie just wanted a little peace after a stressful week. She had driven over 200 miles through empty fields and small towns. Just to stop at a gas station on a quiet stretch of highway, she filled up her old SUV, a car she'd owned since last year. She felt tired, the heat of the summer afternoon still lingering in the air, and she just wanted to get home and rest. A cold sip of soda was the only thing that could ease her fatigue. But as she was pumping gas, a familiar sound suddenly shattered the silence of the gas station. The slow, gravelly roll of tires made Lizzie jump. When she looked up, a police car, its flashing lights bright on top, was approaching. A cold shiver ran down her spine, for this was the feeling Lizzie had long been familiar with, growing up in a society where she always felt like an outsider. The police car stopped just a few feet away from Lizzie's SUV, and from it stepped a young officer. He wore a uniform with a yellowed badge, stains on his clothes that were impossible to ignore. His face tense and his eyes filled with challenge. Jason wore a name Lizzie didn't know, but instinctively felt was the embodiment of a cop who didn't want to admit the truth. He looked Lizzie up and down, his gaze sharp enough to pierce her, making her uneasy. "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" Jason asked, his voice slow, each word laced with a hint of mockery. Lizzie didn't rush to answer. She knew she had to stay calm. "I'm just getting gas," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with firmness. But clearly, Jason had no intention of letting her off easily. He eyed Lizzie's SUV, his gaze briefly scanning the luxury of the vehicle. Then he turned back, his eyes filled with suspicion. "Your papers." Lizzie pulled out her wallet and handed him her driver's license. But instead of just checking it and handing it back, as she had experienced with police encounters before, Jason didn't let go. He started rummaging through her car, grabbing personal items that she never expected to be checked. "I need to inspect your vehicle," Jason said coldly, as though he had already made up his mind that she couldn't just be a regular customer getting gas. Lizzie felt the prejudice in his actions right from the start. These actions weren't for professional reasons, but for something that not everyone would recognize. It was the blatant racism Lizzie had lived with for years. She wasn't just a woman, she was a black person. And that was why Jason didn't afford her the respect she deserved. Lizzie maintained her composure, not wanting to let her emotions show. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "The car registration is in there," she said, pointing to the document holder in the car, hoping this would stop the unreasonable search. But Jason didn't respond. Instead, he yanked open the glove compartment, tossing everything out without any clear reason. Everything was disturbed. Lizzie's purse thrown aside, her personal papers scattered all over the seat. She felt violated, not just physically, but mentally as well. He eventually found what he was looking for. But then Jason threw the car registration on the ground and looked at Lizzie with a look of disdain. "No need to make a mess like that," she said softly, though a sense of hurt began to rise within her. Just when Lizzie thought it was over, Jason suddenly moved closer, his tone even colder. "I don't like your attitude." Before Lizzie could react, Jason unexpectedly shoved her shoulder, causing her to stumble back toward the SUV. The sharp pain briefly left Lizzie disoriented, but she quickly regained her balance, refusing to fall. Every time a police officer abused their power, Lizzie felt like she was reliving painful memories of the past. She had learned to face such blows without letting them defeat her. "What are you to me?" Jason growled, his voice threatening. But when Lizzie looked back, her gaze was unwavering. Don't we all deserve to be treated fairly? Lizzie looked him straight in the eye, unflinching. But the contempt in Jason's eyes only made the tension more palpable. As Jason continued to follow unclear orders, Lizzie felt that something was terribly wrong. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a routine check. This was an abuse of power, part of a system that had gone unchecked for too long, and it was only just beginning. At that moment, the air around them thickened, tense enough to be cut with a knife. Lizzie stood there frozen for a moment, taking deep breaths to face what would come next. She could feel each heavy breath, but also the rising strength from within. She knew she couldn't and wouldn't give up in this moment. Jason stood in front of her, his gaze full of challenge. "I don't like your attitude," he said, his voice threatening, as though this would be the end of their conversation. But Lizzie didn't yield, didn't lower her head. Before Lizzie could respond or react, Jason suddenly stepped forward and forcefully pushed her toward the SUV. The cold sensation of his hand on her body was sharp, and before Lizzie could do anything, he lifted his foot and kicked her leg. The kick was not only strong but also unexpected, a blow straight to her vulnerable spot. A sharp clang echoed as Jason's boot struck her leg, and Lizzie fell to the ground in a painful heap. The pain made her feel like everything around her was spinning. She felt the dirt beneath her, the dust clinging to her clothes. It felt awful, but Lizzie didn't collapse. She couldn't. The pain in her leg didn't stop Lizzie. Despite her trembling bones, she stood firm. This wasn't just a fall. It was a symbol of resistance. She had to get up not just for herself, but for everyone who had no voice in this society. Though her leg ached to the bone and the humiliation was overwhelming, Lizzie couldn't allow herself to become the next victim in a system so accustomed to injustice. Outside the gas station, a young man around 16 years old who had been waiting in line to buy a drink accidentally turned to witness this scene. He saw the police officer not just doing his job, but abusing his power to act violently against a woman who didn't resist. He didn't think much, just instinctively pulled out his phone and began recording the scene, capturing the moment slowly but surely. He knew this would be a moment that couldn't be relived, a moment that needed to be recorded even if no one asked. As Lizzie stood up, her face betraying no emotion, but her eyes burning like fire. This wasn't the first time she had faced violence, but today she was no longer a victim. Today she was a warrior. She looked at Jason with eyes full of fearlessness. She felt it deep within her. She would no longer let any wrongs go unchallenged. This officer wasn't just doing his job. He was a symbol of the abuse of power, and Lizzie, one way or another, would bring him to light. This wasn't just her fight. It was the fight of all those who had been oppressed and overlooked in a society divided by racism. Jason, now starting to realize that things were not as simple as he thought, looked at Lizzie. The strength in her eyes wasn't something an oppressor could easily extinguish. He didn't say another word, simply turned and walked back toward his patrol car, as if hoping that silence would settle everything. But Lizzie knew that silence would only make things worse. She had stood up, and nothing could bring her back down. Though her leg ached and her body still trembled, her soul was steadier than ever. She had become someone who could not be subdued, someone unafraid to face injustice. As Jason walked back to his car, another vehicle passed by the gas station. The window rolled down, and a middle-aged man who was driving had witnessed the entire ordeal. But instead of remaining silent, he looked at Lizzie and gave her an encouraging smile. It was a look full of sympathy, but also a deep understanding of what she was going through. At that moment, Lizzie realized that even though she was just one person, the power of the truth would be stronger than anything else. Her story had been recorded, and now it no longer belonged just to her. It had become part of a larger struggle, a fight for justice and the change that this society desperately needed. As she turned to enter her car, Lizzie didn't look back. She knew that once the truth was out, nothing could stop change. She had entered this fight, and she would not stop until justice was served. But Lizzie also knew that this was just the beginning of a long journey. She had found her strength, and now it was time for her to act to change everything. Kicks like that would not stop her. Soon after the young man's video was posted online, Lizzie's life changed forever. She could feel the shift in the atmosphere and the way people viewed her and in her own heart. The violent scene involving Jason, his powerful kick, and his aggressive attitude had been captured clearly and irrefutably. In a short time, the video spread like wildfire across all social media platforms. People started sharing the video, commenting, and discussing it. Many could hardly believe that a police officer could act like this towards a regular citizen, especially a black woman. The comments on the video were not only filled with outrage over the violent actions, but also empathy and support from the community. A powerful wave of protest rose, reaching beyond local and national borders, becoming a social issue that needed immediate resolution. Lizzie noticed that even strangers began speaking up with calls for justice. Spreading some expressed sympathy for her, while others condemned the police officer's actions. On social media platforms, the hashtag #justice forum, Lizzie quickly became a trending topic. From personal comments to posts by social activists, everyone was calling for a clear change in the treatment of people of color and affirming every citizen's right to be protected. Soon after the first phone call from the FBI rang, cutting through the silence in Lizzie's room, the voice on the other end was clear. Lizzie, we need to act immediately. The situation has spiraled out of control, and you need to be ready for this fight. It felt like a powerful rush of cold water had hit her head. Shaking Lizzie awake clearer and stronger than ever before, she realized that what had happened wasn't just a personal event, but an uncompromising fight against an entire system. A system that had protected the injustices and crimes of those who abused their power. A system that had failed to protect people like her, allowing people like Jason to act without consequence. For years, Lizzie had lived in an unfair world. She knew the reality of racism, knowing she would never be treated fairly unless she fought for it. But the fight wasn't always clear, and resistance wasn't always recognized. She had once accepted this life, once saw it as an inseparable part of existence. But that kick, the kick that caused her pain, but more importantly, the kick that made her realize she couldn't keep tolerating it. No more hesitation, Lizzie thought to herself. She could no longer stay silent. She couldn't just stand by and hope that things would change on their own. This fight had to start now, and Lizzie could not remain on the sidelines. She knew that what she was about to do wouldn't be easy. There would surely be those who would oppose her, those who would try to extinguish this flame. But Lizzie was ready. She felt the strength rising within her, the power of truth and resistance. She could not and would not be a victim again. A fight would never be simple, but once the first steps were taken, there was no turning back. Lizzie picked up the phone and confirmed with the FBI that she would not back down. This was no longer just her fight. It was the fight of everyone who was and would face this injustice. The fight of all those without a voice, of all those forgotten by society. Lizzie knew that the system wouldn't change just because of a video or a call for justice. Real change would come from persistence, from standing up against injustice, and refusing to back down no matter how many challenges or dangers she faced. But she would be the one to lead this fight, and Lizzie's battle had begun. Since that kick, Lizzie realized that this issue had surpassed the limits of a simple personal event. She was no longer just a woman abused by a police officer's power. She was confronting an outdated and rotten system, one that protected those who abused their power and committed violence. Injustice wasn't just present in one individual, but in a network of powerful people who had been manipulated, eroding the public's trust in justice. With each passing day, Lizzie became more aware that this fight wasn't just about demanding justice for herself, but also about fighting against an unjust system that had rooted itself deep in society. She knew she couldn't stop at a video or a lawsuit. She had to dig deeper into the layers of the power structure. That was what Lizzie had made up her mind to do. She began her investigation utilizing all the resources she could access. Lizzie was no longer just a victim of a specific incident. She had become an investigator, a challenger of power. Bit by bit, she uncovered the secrets of the people who had protected Jason, those who had contributed to building this system, where misconduct was never addressed, where power was abused and covered up. Secret meetings and anonymous sources started to reveal terrifying truths. Lizzie knew that Jason wasn't the only one with issues. The people behind him were the root of all this suffering. The police chief, high-ranking officers, influential figures in law enforcement, each one of them was complicit in the wrongdoing, but had never been held accountable. Every one of them had stains on their record, dirty money, shady decisions that the system had shielded. The video had sparked an outpouring of anger, but Lizzie knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a long, challenging battle. She couldn't stop at just criticizing an individual. The issue was bigger and deeper. The lack of transparency, the cover-ups of crimes, and the manipulation of power to protect the guilty one. Evening after gathering enough evidence from secret meetings, Lizzie decided to take action. She called together a group of trusted journalists and some reputable lawyers. This would be a full-scale assault, not only targeting Jason, but also those who protected him, those who had allowed this misconduct to persist for so many years. "We need to bring this to light," Lizzie said in the private meeting. We cannot let this system continue protecting people like Jason. We have to make the world understand that this is not an isolated case. It's part of a larger problem, a network of power that protects each other regardless of the suffering they cause. She wasn't just calling for change, she was preparing for the final blows. Lizzie understood that this fight wouldn't be easy. The people behind Jason and his accomplices wouldn't stay silent. They would fight back. They would try to extinguish this struggle, but Lizzie wasn't afraid. She wasn't turning back. It had been too long that she had lived in the shadows of fear and silence. Each step Lizzie took now was carefully calculated. She knew this fight was not only about achieving justice for herself, but also for all those who had been harmed by an unjust system. She wouldn't allow these abusers of power to continue ruining the lives of innocent people, especially those who had lived under the shadow of racism and injustice. The next day, Lizzie decided to send a detailed report to the FBI, requesting that they conduct a deeper investigation into the network behind this. She attached all the documents and evidence she had gathered. She didn't just want to restore her own honor. She wanted to expose the people who had used their power to create a system that covered up crimes. But Lizzie also realized that she needed to be cautious. The people behind Jason were powerful, and they wouldn't hesitate to use any means to protect themselves. They could make things difficult for her, even threaten her life. But Lizzie wasn't afraid. She had learned that fear was the only thing that could stop her from achieving her goal, and she wasn't afraid anymore. She entered this fight not just because of a kick, but for a larger ideal: justice, transparency, and change. A strong woman was standing up against a corrupt system, and she wouldn't stop until justice was served. And Lizzie knew that this battle had only just begun. Lizzie's story was no longer just a personal incident. It had become a large-scale campaign, a movement spreading across major cities. From small neighborhoods, protests started erupting powerfully. Her image, that of the strong woman who stood up against oppression, not just in a single event, but in an entire system of racial discrimination, had become a symbol for the fight for justice. The videos of Lizzie being assaulted, the police attacking without reason, sparked an intense wave of anger on social media. Hashtags like #justice for Lizzie and #standup for justice quickly became trending topics, spreading like wildfire. From ordinary citizens to social activists and even politicians, everyone voiced their support for Lizzie and called for action against the injustice she had suffered. This created immense pressure on powerful organizations. Protests began appearing in major cities such as New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. People from students to regular workers, from civil rights organizations to women's groups flooded the streets, raising banners demanding justice for Lizzie and calling for a change in the police system. Lizzie realized that she was no longer alone. The protests weren't just an expression of frustration with one police officer. They were a rebellion of millions who had lived under racial discrimination and injustice in society. Every step Lizzie took now represented not just herself, but the millions of people worldwide fighting for their rights and fairness. Civil rights organizations like Black Lives Matter quickly stepped in to support the movement, organizing protests calling for boycotts and pushing for legal action. Slogans like "No justice, no peace and justice for Lizzie" echoed through the streets. Each cheer, each waving flag in the protests served as a reminder that this wasn't just a fight for Lizzie. It was a fight for all those who had endured oppression. People weren't just standing up to condemn an act of violence, they were uncovering an outdated system, a system that had allowed racism and oppression to persist for centuries without change. Lizzie became a symbol not just because of the suffering she endured, but because she did what very few dared to do: stand up against injustice. As the protests continued, Lizzie and her legal team pushed forward with their investigation, delving into the police officers, politicians, and officials involved. She didn't just want Jason to pay for his actions. She wanted to expose the entire power network that protected people like him. Each document, each testimony, and each video capturing police misconduct became a building block of justice. Lizzie knew this was not just a legal battle. It was a social revolution. The unwavering support from civil rights groups, women's organizations, and the Black community gave Lizzie strength. She felt that these protests weren't just acts of resistance. They were an opportunity for people to reclaim their voice in society. Voices that had been silenced before, people overlooked by the system, were now being heard. They weren't just standing with Lizzie, they were standing up for themselves, for their own rights. In the weeks that followed, the resistance only grew stronger. Every morning, Lizzie received messages of encouragement from all over, from those who had joined the protests, from the support organizations. Strong voices were calling for change, for the end of a racist system deeply embedded in society. At the same time, media organizations began paying attention to Lizzie's story. She was no longer just a victim. She had become a pioneer in the fight against racism. National TV stations, major newspapers reported on her every day, conducting live interviews through which she could deliver her powerful message about justice and change. Lizzie hadn't just changed her own life. She had changed how society viewed injustice. Despite the challenges, Lizzie continued to lead this revolution. She understood that this was just the beginning, but the ripple effect of this movement was already making those behind the system tremble. The protests were not only a reflection of anger, but also a strong call for change. And Lizzie, the brave woman who had risen from a kick, had become an unstoppable force. As the revolution spread, Lizzie was no longer just an oppressed woman. She had become a symbol of courage, of a global movement against racism and injustice. She had become the leader of a powerful wave, motivating people not only to speak up, but to act to create a fairer society. And this revolution, it wasn't just going to end with protests. It would continue with powerful changes in policy law and the hearts of every individual. Lizzie knew that when one person stood up, the whole world could rise with them. As Lizzie dug deeper into her investigation, she realized that Jason Ward wasn't the only one with problems. The kick he delivered to her at the gas station was just a small part of a much larger system, riddled with racism and abuse of power. People like Jason were not alone. They were merely pieces in a broader picture of corruption and the unreasonable protection of powerful figures who shielded misconduct. This not only angered Lizzie, but also made her feel deceived. The racist behavior she had endured, the nightmares she faced daily, were not just isolated incidents caused by a few rogue officers. They were part of a much larger network where higher-ups officials and even the heads of police agencies were covering up such actions. One morning, as Lizzie sat at her desk, files related to Jason Ward and his colleagues were spread out before her. Information from sources within the police force she had built allowed her to trace a network of officials who had protected the actions of these abusive officers. Following the trail, Lizzie discovered that Jason didn't just have a history full of complaints about violent behavior. He also had tight connections with the leaders of local police agencies. These relationships were not merely professional, but were deeply personal dealings involving promises of protection and career advancement. That's why complaints against him had always been swiftly silenced and never properly investigated. As Lizzie slowly uncovered the truth, she realized that confronting Jason was just the first step. She needed to look beyond him at the system he and people like him had been exploiting. The figures behind Jason were not faceless individuals, but real people with immense power. People who could manipulate the legal and police systems to protect each other, no matter how illegal their actions were. But Lizzie was no longer alone. She had built a strong alliance from journalists and lawyers to civil rights organizations, all united in the goal of exposing the corruption within this system. These allies not only believed in her, but also believed in the change she was leading. They were ready to take risks, providing evidence and confidential documents to help her uncover the truth and bring those responsible to justice. From the information provided by her allies, Lizzie was slowly piecing together a comprehensive picture of corruption and misconduct within the police force. One of the key discoveries was a senior official within the police department, someone closely connected to Jason and his allies, who not only protected these abuses, but was also involved in cover-ups, falsifying reports, and creating fake documents to hide the truth. The relationships between officials and police officers, from low-ranking officers to high-ranking ones, had formed a closed network, protecting each other and blocking efforts to investigate. To deal with this issue, Lizzie knew she couldn't rely on the current legal system alone. She had to create widespread pressure to force these corrupt individuals to face consequences. In the following days, Lizzie and her legal team continued gathering more evidence, verifying documents, and interviewing key witnesses. She also kept connecting with journalists, those willing to publish information to expose the wrongdoings Lizzie and her team had uncovered. Every step Lizzie took now was not just a battle for one person. It was the battle of an entire community, a movement fighting for fairness and transparency. She didn't just want to see Jason punished. She wanted to bring the entire system into the light, expose the truths it had been trying to hide. Those who had tried to silence her would no longer exist in the shadows, no longer be able to manipulate and abuse their power. At this moment, Lizzie felt the weight of the struggle. She was not only facing those who abused power, but also confronting the system that had protected them. But that did not discourage her. Each piece of evidence, each testimony, each document she gathered was a brick in the building of justice she was constructing. She understood that no path would be easy, but if no one stood up, this corruption would continue forever. With the support of the community, the help from civil rights organizations, and the determination of fearless journalists, Lizzie was ready to enter the next phase of the fight. This was not just her battle, it was the battle of all those who had been forgotten, pushed to the margins of society, and Lizzie would never stop until these corrupt individuals were exposed and justice was served. The power network Lizzie was confronting was a monumental challenge, but she was ready to dismantle it. This fight wasn't just one woman's personal struggle. It was the fight of an entire generation, a movement demanding change and fairness for all. The struggle against a corrupt system. Lizzie stood in the eye of a storm. She had entered a battle whose scale and depth she could never have anticipated. As she uncovered leads from reliable sources, the information she gathered acted like a fire burning through the silence that had long enveloped the corruption of an entire system. Jason, the officer who attacked her, was just one small link in a larger chain, and now Lizzie was starting to expose the rot that few dared to face. Investigations were soon underway. Lizzie was no longer just a victim. She had become a warrior for justice. She began expanding her investigation not only on Jason but also on the officials, the police leaders, those who had quietly protected these wrongdoings without anyone daring to speak up. Thanks to the support of her FBI colleagues, Lizzie had access to crucial documents and evidence about those who were involved in power abuse. Through these investigations, Lizzie discovered that Jason was not the only officer involved in racist behavior. She found that behind the protection of his colleagues in the police force, there were high-ranking officials who shielded such actions, forming a vast network that no one could easily infiltrate. Those behind it had created a system to protect the corrupt, and this not only affected the police, but extended into other government agencies. The evidence she collected went beyond testimonies. It included exchanges, emails, internal reports Lizzie obtained from close sources, copies of documents from secret meetings between senior officials and the police brought to light suspicious relationships. These meetings were not meant to discuss security or community protection, but rather to protect wrongdoings to ensure that police misconduct would never be exposed. The deeper Lizzie dug, the more terrifying the truth became. An entire government apparatus was protecting these power abusers. One of the names Lizzie found in the documents was David Hale, the head of the Regional Police Bureau, a man with a history of covering up corrupt officers and concealing cases of violence. Hale wasn't just a powerful official, but also had extensive connections in politics, connections that could prevent anyone from exposing the truth. These findings made Lizzie realize that she wasn't just fighting an individual or a few corrupt officers. She was fighting an entire system that had been built and protected over years. She felt this was a battle that couldn't stop because it didn't just affect her. It affected millions of others, oppressed by this system. Lizzie knew that if she didn't act immediately, everything she had done so far would be meaningless. She decided to team up with legal groups and investigative journalists to bring these documents to the public. Emergency meetings were organized with civil rights lawyers, social organizations, and prominent journalists to prepare for a comprehensive media campaign. Public investigations began to take shape, and the information Lizzie uncovered quickly spread across news outlets and social media, drawing widespread attention. People weren't just angry about the misconduct the officers had engaged in. They were furious about the unconditional protection the system provided to these individuals. Lizzie's story wasn't just the tale of a woman being attacked. It was the story of a system crumbling, of the oppressed standing up to demand justice. Protests continued to grow stronger, and people weren't just protesting for Lizzie. They were protesting for everyone who had ever suffered from racism and injustice. The villains Lizzie uncovered in her investigations were not just faceless officers. They were powerful people who controlled a decaying machine these individuals had shielded, protected, and created a system of racism that mistreated everyone, making society rot from the inside out. Now Lizzie was ready to bring them into the light. As everything reached its climax, Lizzie didn't stop. She didn't just want to expose these criminals, she wanted to create permanent change within the system. She knew change wouldn't come easily, but she also knew that once the truth was revealed, no one would be able to remain in the shadows anymore. Lizzie's fight wasn't just about one woman being attacked. It was the fight of all those who had been forgotten, who had suffered from racism, and who believed that fairness was a right for all. She wasn't just fighting to get justice for herself. She was fighting for future generations so they wouldn't have to live in a society like this. With the support of her allies and the strong backing of the public, Lizzie was ready to face the villains, not only to protect herself, but to rebuild a fairer society where people could live without fear of discrimination and injustice. As Lizzie embarked on her battle against the corrupt system, she wasn't just facing individual criminals, but an entire government apparatus deeply embedded in every crack of society. Her struggle, though far from easy, had already led to clear results. Lizzie's actions were no longer a mere breeze in the storms of politics and justice. They had become a blazing fire burning through the silence and protection from the system bringing the truth to light. Jason, the officer who attacked Lizzie, finally faced the consequences of his violent actions. After the video of his misconduct went viral on social media, the community could no longer remain silent. The public outcry pushed the investigation to new heights. Not only Jason, but also his colleagues, those who were responsible for upholding justice, yet allowed this wrongdoing to slide, were forced to face the consequences of their inaction. However, Lizzie's struggle didn't end there. She realized that simply removing a criminal officer from the force was never enough. Jason, who could be fired and face some charges, was just one fish in a polluted pond. Lizzie knew that to achieve real change, she needed to confront individuals much more powerful than Jason, those who'd been protecting the misconduct of people like him. As soon as Jason was fired, Lizzie decided not to stop but to expand the investigation. The documents, records, and secret exchanges she had collected over time became a sharp weapon. She started digging deeper into the relationships between high-ranking police officials and powerful politicians. Lizzie wasn't merely looking to expose specific individuals, but to target a rotten system where injustice and racism had been allowed to persist unchecked for far too long. Lizzie's investigations uncovered a series of wrongdoings, not only at the local level, but at higher levels as well. She discovered that in addition to officers like Jason, there were police officials who had protected their colleagues' misconduct, not only to maintain power, but also to safeguard their personal interests. These investigations didn't just bring names like Jason to light, they served as a warning to the entire police system, which had been drowning in corruption. But even as the guilty parties faced charges and were dismissed, Lizzie realized that the fight was far from over. She knew that while this victory provided a sense of justice, the deeper societal issues remained intact. The price Lizzie paid in this fight wasn't just a physical one, but a mental and emotional sacrifice as well. The battle against racism was never a fight that could end with a personal victory. Once again, Lizzie faced unpredictable challenges. The structures that had existed in society for centuries could not be easily dismantled. Those who were corrupt and abused their power never accepted defeat easily. Even though Jason was fired and the officials who protected him were exposed, Lizzie knew that many others were waiting for the opportunity to continue maintaining injustice in the shadows. Just as Lizzie had anticipated, this fight couldn't stop here. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for all those who had been oppressed by this system, and with every step forward, every small victory, Lizzie realized that real change wasn't something that could be achieved through a single campaign or protest. It required a long, patient, and persistent process to help the community recognize the deep-rooted racism, the abuse of power, and the quest for justice. With the support of civil rights groups, investigative journalists, and the community that stood by her, Lizzie continued her mission. Each day, her allies grew stronger, and protests erupted all over. Each voice, each action became part of the revolution against racial discrimination. Now, as the wrongdoers were brought into the light, Lizzie never stopped fighting, never stopped demanding change within the police force and the entire political system. The protests were no longer just reactions to the actions of one individual. They had become an all-out war for justice and equality. The people who took to the streets weren't just standing up for Lizzie, they were standing up for themselves, for everyone who had been oppressed. And while many began to change their perceptions, Lizzie never forgot that this fight was far from over. She wasn't just asking for justice for herself. She was fighting for all those who had endured racism, for all those who had never had a chance to be heard. She had started a battle whose end had never been determined. Lizzie knew that no matter what, she would never stop. Her resistance would never retreat. This struggle would continue until real change happened. She would keep standing up, keep fighting for a fairer society where everyone was treated equally, regardless of skin color or ethnicity. Lizzie's story was one of great difficulty, but also immense strength. From the very first moments of confronting racism to the point where she decided she would not back down, fighting for justice not only for herself, but for all those who were oppressed, every step Lizzie took brought her closer to the change in a society marked by the scars of injustice. But this story doesn't end here. Lizzie was not just a woman who was attacked. She had become a symbol of the unrelenting fight against racism for all those who had been overlooked and unheard. This journey wasn't just a personal battle. It was the fight of millions of people across the world who have been and continue to long for a fair society free from discrimination. It was the desire to be treated equally, to be respected as real human beings. The protests exploded not just because of a violent cop, but because of all the injustices that the system had hidden and protected over the years. And Lizzie had become the leader of that movement, not only reclaiming justice for herself, but for all those who couldn't speak up. It was an endless fight against a corrupt system, against those who exploited power to maintain injustice. However, Lizzie's story didn't end after she achieved recognition and initial victories. This fight wasn't just about a single event that happened in one day. It was a fight to abolish racism, to build a society where everyone is treated equally. Although Lizzie had won the first victory, she knew that the storm wasn't over. She had just started the war, and every victory was merely a stepping stone in the ongoing fight for justice. Every day, people in society that can be a part of this movement, from protests and community dialogues to speaking up when witnessing injustice, all of these contribute to an ongoing movement. Justice is not just made up of grand moments. It is the small yet meaningful actions in our daily lives. Lizzie's fight is a clear example that change doesn't come from one individual or one event, but from an entire community rising up against injustice. Once justice is found at the heart of society, it will not just be a victory for one person, but a victory for all of humanity. And that is what Lizzie has initiated, a movement that cannot be extinguished by any force. Lizzie's story is not an end. It is the beginning of a longer fight for justice has not yet been fully realized. The storm she has sparked has not only changed a city or a region, but has shaken the entire society. And Lizzie has shown that change begins with small steps, simple actions, but when combined, they can create a powerful wave strong enough to shake the entire system. While Lizzie has achieved some early victories, the fight is far from over. This battle is not just about what has happened, but about what is to come. The next steps of Lizzie and her allies will decide whether this society will truly change. The villains, the manipulators, and the protectors of racial injustice still remain. And Lizzie knows that only when they are brought into the light will justice truly be served. Therefore, the fight does not end here. There are still many who have not yet spoken up. Many struggles still waiting. But one thing is certain. Lizzie will never stop standing up, and another crucial point, we cannot remain silent and look the other way. Lizzie's story is a powerful reminder that justice is not something to be taken for granted. It must be fought for. And when one person stands up, they can create an unstoppable movement. Lizzie's battle has never ended, and it will not end until all of our voices are heard. But this is just the beginning. The cost of justice is not only the efforts of one person, but the ongoing struggle of society as a whole. And Lizzie has proven one thing. A single kick can be the beginning of a storm that cannot be stopped. If this story has awakened you, if it has made you rethink the injustices in society, don't forget to subscribe now, because there are many more stories like this to be told. Struggles that have never ended, and we will always be here to capture every moment. Share this story, because when you stand up, you will never be alone.